Imagine you're sitting in your high school history class, right?
Yeah.
And you're learning the standard story about America during World War II.
Right. The usual narrative.
Yeah, exactly. You hear about the draft, the unity on the home front, the victory gardens, the big economic boom. And, that's all true. But today, we want to completely disrupt that narrative for you.
We really do, because the reality is so much more complicated.
It really is. We're going to introduce you to this incredibly jarring paradox that happened in the exact same year, on the exact same coast, to people of the exact same descent.
And we have some incredible source material to guide us through this. We are looking at bilateral diplomatic agreements, LAPD arrest records, internal government memos, and even personal letters sent by laborers back to their families.
So our mission for this deep dive is to look at two deeply linked events, the Bracero Program and the Zoot riots. Our goal here is to uncover this hidden layer of World War II history where the United States basically welcomed Mexican labor with open arms while simultaneously treating Mexican-American citizens with, profound contempt.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast.
It is. And if you want to truly understand the complexities of the American home front, you really have to look at who was invited in as a tool and who was violently rejected as a citizen.
You really do. You have to look at the mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to set the scene. So it's August 1942.
Right. The war is in full swing.
Exactly. The selective service system is just pulling millions of American men out of the workforce, drafting them into the military. And on top of that, you have this massive explosion in defense manufacturing.
Oh, the defense jobs were a huge draw. I mean, if you were a farm worker in California making pennies and you heard that factories in Los Angeles were paying top dollar to build planes, you moved.
Right, you'd pack up immediately, which of course creates this terrifying vacuum in the sectors that people were leaving behind, mainly agriculture and the railroads.
Yeah, the agricultural lobby in Washington was panicking. You read their testimonies from early 1942, and they're saying that entire crops of sugar beets and citrus are quite literally rotting in the fields.
Wow, just rotting because there's nobody to pick them.
Nobody. Zero manpower. And the railroad crisis was honestly even worse. The railways were the entire circulatory system for the Allied war effort, Yeah. But maintaining those tracks laying steel in the desert heat, it's brutal work.
And all the guys who usually did that work had left for the shipyards.
Exactly. So the domestic labor pool is entirely tapped out. So the U.S. government gets desperate and turns to Mexico. They initiate these formal bilateral negotiations, which officially birthed the Bracero Program in August of 1942.
And the scale of this program is it's staggering. We're talking hundreds of thousands of workers during the war years alone.
Oh, absolutely. Just for the railroads, there were over 100,000 contracts.
Yeah.
But agriculture dwarfed that. The agricultural lobby actually lobbied to keep the program going way past the end of the war.
Wait, really? It didn't stop in 1945.
Not at all. It ran all the way until 1964. Over 4 million individual contracts were processed.
Over 4 million. That is just, wow. But the name of the program itself, that tells you so much, doesn't it?
What's fascinating here is the etymology of the word bracero. It comes from the Spanish word brazo, which literally means arm.
Just arm.
Right. They didn't call it the Mexican Worker Program. They called it the ARM Program. It signaled to everyone, the public, the employers, the workers, that these men were wanted merely as physical tools, just hands and arms, not as whole people.
I was thinking about this, and it's like renting heavy machinery for a construction project, right?
That is a very apt comparison.
You bring in the bulldozer to do the heavy lifting, but you definitely don't invite the bulldozer to live in your house or stay for dinner. You just want the utility.
Exactly, and you send it back the second the job is done. The structural impermanence was the entire point of the Bracero contract.
But this machinery rental arrangement, it did come with official paperwork and promises, didn't it? Like, Mexico didn't just hand people over.
Oh, no. The Mexican government was highly aware of how Mexican labor had been treated in the U.S. before. I mean, during the Great Depression in the 30s, the U.S. deported hundreds of thousands of people of Mexican descent, including U.S. citizens, just to get them off welfare rolls.
Right, the repatriation drives. Just awful.
So Mexico demanded strict protections. The bilateral agreement legally mandated a minimum wage, which was around 30 cents an hour. It mandated adequate, free housing, medical care, and it even had a non-discrimination clause.
Wow. Okay, so on paper, it sounds like a decent deal.
On paper, yes. The tragedy is the massive gap between the contract and the reality. The enforcement was basically non-existent.
Okay, so how did they get around the rules? Because a government-sponsored program can't just openly refuse to pay people, right?
Well, they wouldn't just withhold the paycheck. They'd use the isolation of the rural camps. Like the contract said, free housing. But the growers would force the workers to buy their meals in the camp mess halls at wildly inflated prices.
Oh, so they skimmed it right back.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the food was often terrible. Just beans and tortillas or even spoiled meat. And they'd use company store tactics. Need gloves, need a hoe. They'd deduct it from your pay.
Speaking of the hoe, the sources mentioned the short-handled hoe. That sounded brutal.
Oh, it was horrific. It forced the worker to stay bent over at the waist for 10 hours a day. It caused permanent, debilitating spinal damage.
That's horrifying. But wait, what about this mandated savings deduction? The sources talked about a 10% withholding.
Yes, the 10% deduction.
Yeah.
Both governments agreed that 10% of a bracero's wages would be withheld by the American employer to be put into a Mexican bank account as a savings nest egg.
Okay, so they'd have money when they got back. In theory.
In theory. In practice, the logistics were a nightmare. The U.S. grower gave it to the U.S. government, who gave it to a bank, who wired it to Mexico. At every step, records were lost or destroyed.
So the workers they just lost the money.
Hundreds of thousands of them. They'd go to their local bank in Mexico after grueling labor, and the bank would say, "We have no record of your money." Millions of dollars essentially vanished. It was state-managed wage theft.
But how did they get away with that? Why didn't the workers just, complain or strike?
Because of how the visa was structured. A bracero was tied to one specific employer. If you complained about the spoiled food or the missing money, the grower could just terminate your contract on the spot.
And if you lose the contract,
You lose your legal status. You become an undocumented alien subject to immediate deportation. So you have a guy in a remote camp, he doesn't speak English, the federal inspectors are nowhere to be found, and his boss holds his literal right to be in the country. It was a trap.
that is just, it's a completely closed loop of coercion. But we should be clear, these men weren't just passive victims, right? I read some of the translated letters they sent home.
Yes, individual agency is so important to highlight here. They were making a rational economic choice. Mexico was dealing with high inflation.
Right. And in those letters, the focus wasn't just on how terrible the conditions were. They talked about the remittances, the money they were sending back to their families in Michoacan and Jalisco.
Exactly. Even with the theft and the deductions, they could still send back more money than they'd make in a year back home. They knew it was exploitative, but they sacrificed themselves to ensure their families survived.
Which makes the emotional impact of this so heavy. Imagine knowing you are desperately needed for your sweat. You are literally feeding the Allied armies, but you are entirely disposable. The moment the harvest is done, you're discarded.
It's a profound psychological burden. They were invisible until needed and then erased. And that dynamic, that underlying prejudice against Mexican people, wasn't just happening in the rural fields. It was about to explode violently in the cities.
Right. Which brings us to the urban counterpart of this story. We're moving from the agricultural fields of the Central Valley to the streets of wartime Los Angeles.
The contrast here is so vital because in LA you have a massive population of Mexican-American youth. They aren't foreign guest workers, they are U.S. citizens. Born in California, English-speaking, fully American.
But they were being treated as anything but American.
Exactly. These young people, the Pachucos and Pachucas, they were developing their own distinct subculture. Because they were marginalized by the white civic establishment, they created their own identity.
And the most visible part of that identity was the Zoot suit. Let's talk about the Zoot suit, because it is quite the look.
Oh, it's a statement. It originated in the Harlem jazz clubs with African-American musicians like Cab Calloway, and it spread to the West Coast.
Right. It's this suit with incredibly broad padded shoulders, a coat that hangs down to the knees, and these high-waisted pants that balloon out at the thigh and then peg super tight at the ankle.
It required yards and yards of heavy fabric. And for kids who were told they were invisible, who couldn't even swim in the public pools on normal days, wearing a zoot suit was a way to take up space. You could not ignore a kid in a zoot suit.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because in 1942, wearing that specific suit suddenly became like proof of treason.
This raises an important question about how wartime anxiety is weaponized. The War Production Board had issued strict rationing rules for clothing to save fabric for military uniforms.
Right. No pleats, no cuffs.
Exactly. So because the zoot suit used so much excess fabric, critics and the press started branding it as inherently unpatriotic.
Which is wild, that a clothing style, a way for teenagers to express themselves, could be weaponized as proof that they were enemies of the state.
And the press in LA ran with it. They painted these kids as selfish and dangerous while the rest of the country was sacrificing for the war.
But it wasn't just about the fabric, was it? LA was incredibly tense. They had the blackouts, the military buildup, and they had just forced over 100,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps.
Yes. The city was practically vibrating with paranoia. They had removed one minority group, and the white establishment was actively looking for a new scapegoat. The Pachucos became that target.
And the event that really threw gasoline on that fire was the Sleepy Lagoon case in August of 1942.
When around the exact same time, the Bracero Program is being signed in Mexico.
That timing is incredible. So, Sleepy Lagoon, what happened?
Sleepy Lagoon was a reservoir where Mexican-American kids hung out, mostly because the city pools were segregated. In August, a young man named Jose Gallardo Diaz was found unconscious there, and he later died.
And the cause of death was ambiguous, right? Like it could have been a hit and run?
Completely ambiguous. The medical examiners weren't sure. But the LAPD didn't run a normal investigation. They used his death as an excuse to launch a massive, militarized dragnet on the Mexican-American community.
They arrested over 600 kids just for being in the wrong neighborhood.
Over 600. And they ended up indicting 22 of them for murder.
And the trial was an absolute joke. Judge Charles Frick, I read the sources on this, he made them sit isolated in a prisoner's box away from their lawyers.
He also refused to let them change their clothes or get haircuts for the entire trial.
Wait, for months they couldn't wash up?
For months. He intentionally wanted them to look disheveled and menacing to the all-white jury. They weren't tried on evidence, they were tried on their ethnicity and their aesthetics.
And the local newspapers are just printing these screaming headlines the whole time, calling them bloodthirsty Zoot suit gangs.
The press basically acted as the PR wing for the LAPD. They spent a year conditioning the public to view these U.S. citizens as a violent, un-American threat.
So when a sensationalist press relentlessly tells the public that a specific group of teenagers is dangerous and unpatriotic, it's only a matter of time before someone takes the law into their own hands.
And that tension broke in June of 1943, the Zoot Suit riots.
Okay, let's detail this, because the word riot almost feels misleading based on what actually happened. It started on June 3rd, right?
Yes, after a minor scuffle between some sailors and some local kids, a mob of sailors organized themselves. They actually commandeered a fleet of taxicabs and had the drivers take them straight into East Los Angeles.
They took cabs to go hunting for kids.
Exactly. They were specifically hunting anyone wearing a Zoot suit. And over the next 5 days, it just escalated. It wasn't just dozens of sailors. It became thousands of servicemen. Marines, Army guys, even off-duty civilians joined in.
The sources described them as storming streetcars, like forcing transit trains to stop so they could drag teenagers out into the street.
They'd go into movie theaters, demand the projectionists turn on the lights, and march down the aisles looking for targets.
And it wasn't just Mexican-American kids either.
No, any youth of color. Black and Filipino kids who wore the style were also attacked. And the violence was incredibly ritualized. They wouldn't just beat them with clubs and lead pipes.
Right, the stripping. They would physically rip the Zoot suits off their bodies.
Yes. They would shred the fabric, burn it in the street, and leave these kids beaten and naked on the pavement. It was about profound public humiliation.
I am just shocked by the hypocrisy here. The very men wearing the uniform of a nation fighting against fascism abroad were behaving like a fascist mob at home.
That is the exact paradox we are talking about. And we need to be very clear about the police response. The LAPD didn't just fail to stop it. They were complicit.
Yeah, I read that police officers would literally follow the mobs around.
They would. They'd stand by while a teenager was being beaten with brass knuckles, wait for the mob to leave, and then go in and arrest the bleeding victim.
Arrest them for what? Being attacked.
They charged them with vagrancy or disturbing the peace. The police warehoused the victims in jail while letting the mobs roam free.
And the military commanders didn't stop it either. They just let their guys run wild for days.
And the local papers cheered them on. The LA Times basically congratulated the sailors for doing the cops' job.
Which is just nauseating. But the way this violence finally stopped, this is the detail that really ties everything together.
This is the crux of it. The military didn't stop the riots because of civil rights. They stopped it because of international diplomacy.
Right. Because Mexico heard about what was happening in LA, and the Mexican embassy in Washington filed a formal protest.
They told the U.S. State Department, basically, if you let your soldiers murder people of Mexican descent in your streets, we're going to pull the plug on the Bracero program.
We won't send you the hundreds of thousands of workers you need to save your crop.
Exactly. The U.S. government realized their labor supply was threatened, so the military brass finally declared L.A. off-limits to servicemen on June 8th, and the riots stopped.
Wow. Let's just take a breath and place these two historical realities side by side.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the hypocrisy is just undeniable. In the exact same moment, the federal government is moving heaven and earth to import Mexican labor to save the economy, while the local state and military are terrorizing Mexican-American citizens.
They welcomed the labor, but they had absolute contempt for the people.
Yes. The braceros were tolerated strictly because they were legally exploitable. They were silent, temporary, and easily deported. They fit the mold of what the establishment wanted, invisible utility.
But the urban kids, the Pachucos, they had citizenship. They weren't temporary. They used their culture to demand visibility and say, we belong here.
And that demand for visibility was seen as an existential threat. The state responded with uniformed violence,
which set up this brutal long-term consequence for the Mexican-American community. It created this dynamic of conditional opportunity.
Precisely. It sent a clear message.
Yeah.
Your physical sweat is essential for America, but your existence as an equal citizen will be violently resisted. Your citizenship doesn't protect you if you step out of your lane.
It makes you wonder, if you're a high school student learning about the good war, right? How do you reconcile a war fought for global freedom with this kind of domestic reality?
You have to hold both truths. You can't separate the victory gardens from the stolen wages of the braceros or the heroism of the military from the burning Zoot suits in East LA.
So what does this all mean?
It means the history of the home front isn't just a simple story of unified patriotism. It's a complex web of labor, exploitation, and racial control.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought to really mull over. Think about the sheer dissonance of that summer in 1943. If the ultimate metric of your belonging in wartime America was purely how much physical labor could be extracted from your body, and if being born on American soil wasn't enough to protect you from the nation's own soldiers, what did the word citizen actually mean during the Good War?
It's a question that completely redefines the history we think we know.
It really does. Keep questioning the narratives in those textbooks. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.